Nina Carter set foot in Oakwood Estates, a neighborhood that seemed like a peaceful and prosperous paradise, where luxury villas stood side by side, clean streets were bathed in golden sunlight, and the air was fresh. Oakwood Estates looked like a perfect picture of the dream life. She thought this would be the place where she could start over after the years of hardships and exhaustion in the big city. As a young black police officer, Nina understood that working in a calm area like Oakwood Estates would help her shake off the stress and integrate into the community, proving herself. But the truth, like many things in life, was never easy. From the very first moment she stepped into the neighborhood, the feeling of discrimination became evident. The stares from the residents around her made her feel like a strange fish in the ocean. She realized that, although Oakwood Estates appeared to be an ideal society, the people living here had closed their hearts to any differences. She told herself that maybe she was just being too sensitive, that it was just an initial feeling. One morning, as Nina was walking to work, she accidentally came across a scene she would never forget. Samuel Williams, a black man, was selling street goods right outside the neighborhood. He was selling fresh fruit and small household items. But what caught Nina's attention was not his goods, but the conflict happening around him. A group of white people, seemingly residents of the neighborhood, were surrounding him, pointing and shouting. "Get out! No one needs your stuff here," an older man said, his tone filled with contempt. The woman next to him was just as harsh. "We don't need invaders like you ruining the beauty of this neighborhood." Nina stood silently watching. It was a scene she hadn't expected, especially since she had always hoped that moving to Oakwood Estates would be an opportunity to build new relationships, make friends with people, and prove that she was a fair police officer. But now, in just a few short minutes, she realized that not everyone welcomed her presence. But what confused Nina the most was not the clear racism she witnessed, but the indifference of those around her. Other residents in the neighborhood, instead of intervening or speaking out against the actions of the group, just stood and watched. It seemed they had grown accustomed to this discrimination, or perhaps they even shared the views of the troublemakers. Nina felt like an outsider, not belonging to this place, even though she was a member of the police force. That afternoon, Nina attended a community meeting where Oakwood Estates residents gathered to discuss issues in the neighborhood. She had heard many praises about the unity and peace here, but as she entered the meeting room, she could clearly feel a heavy atmosphere. The cold stares directed at her made her feel unwelcome, as if she was the only one who didn't belong. Nevertheless, Nina tried to maintain professionalism, staying calm to participate in the dialogue. In the meeting, Mrs. Patricia Monroe, one of the most powerful figures in the community, stood up to speak. She was a tall woman with gray-brown hair and sharp eyes. Oakwood Estates is a neighborhood of people with values. We have built this place through hard work over the years, and we don't need any changes from the outside, she said, her voice full of pride and arrogance. Her words made Nina feel suffocated. Mrs. Patricia was firmly stating that Oakwood Estates was not a place for change, nor a place for differences. Nina tried to speak up, hoping to create a fair dialogue. "I think this community could be even stronger if we learn to accept each other's differences," Nina said, trying to stay calm. But Mrs. Patricia quickly dismissed her. "We don't need to learn to accept anything. Oakwood Estates is already an ideal place, and will remain that way." Nina's feelings at that moment were indescribable. She realized that Mrs. Patricia was not just a defender of tradition, but also a representative of a system that Nina could not easily change. She was facing a solid wall, where any attempt to bring change was immediately rejected. Nina tried to control her emotions. She knew that confronting racism in a community like Oakwood Estates was not easy. That evening, As Nina sat in her apartment, she felt a deep loneliness. It wasn't the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of someone struggling to find her place in a society that never truly accepted her. The cold stares in the meeting, the indifference from those around her when Samuel was insulted, all of it was like a mirror reflecting the closed nature and discrimination that she could not escape from, no matter how hard she tried. She sighed, determined to continue her work, but a part of her couldn't stop asking, "Do I really belong here?" In that moment of stillness, Nina knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She would have to fight not only for justice, but also against the deeply ingrained prejudices that had long existed in the community she had chosen to work in. An unexpected storm swept through one spring afternoon, making the atmosphere in Oakwood Estates heavier than ever. Nina had heard about the regular community meetings where the influential residents of the neighborhood would gather to discuss issues. But today, she truly realized everything she was facing. Despite being prepared, when she entered the meeting room, Nina still felt unchanged. She was an outsider, someone who didn't belong here. The room was filled with whispers and scrutinizing gazes. The residents appeared well-dressed and refined, but their attitude was cold, even bordering on contempt. Some people looked at Nina with curiosity, while others simply turned away, pretending not to notice. Nevertheless, she tried to remain calm and maintain a polite smile. She knew that in this environment, she would never be a part of them unless she could prove herself trustworthy. However, the tension began to build from the very first moments. The meeting seemed uneventful until Mrs. Patricia Monroe, the powerful woman in the neighborhood, stood up. A murmur spread through the room as she prepared to speak. Mrs. Patricia had a commanding presence, full of confidence and pride, making anyone listen. She was an icon of Oakwood Estates, representing the values of this neighborhood, values built over generations. But today, she made Nina feel like she was being pushed into a completely different world. "We don't need to change anything," Mrs. Patricia began, her voice strong, echoing through the spacious room. "We live in a community where everything is stable, everything is perfect. No one can change Oakwood Estates. We all know that racial differences are meaningless in a community like this. We don't need to open our doors to things that don't belong here." Her words made the air in the room almost bubble with intensity. Some people clapped in agreement, their gazes toward Nina no longer concealing their contempt. Nina's self-respect felt crushed under those words. Despite that, she could not back down. As a police officer, as someone responsible for upholding justice, she couldn't let these conservative views influence her work. She took a deep breath and stood up, trying to remain calm. Although the crowd before her was waiting to hear, Nina felt like a stranger in this conversation. She tried to speak, but her voice in that moment felt weak, unable to withstand the strength of Mrs. Patricia's words. "We need to face the truth," Nina said, her voice quiet but firm. "Nothing is perfect when we don't acknowledge the problems within our community. We need to create an environment where everyone, no matter who they are, feels safe and accepted. This is not just beneficial for the community, it is also our responsibility." Nina's words were not received as she had hoped. Immediately, Mrs. Patricia, without hesitation, countered, "What you're saying is unfounded. Oakwood Estates doesn't need to change. Newcomers only bring disruption, and that will not be tolerated. We cannot let racism ruin the values of this neighborhood." Nina could feel the tension rising in her chest. She knew that if this conversation continued, it would only increase the divide. The others in the room remained silent, but their eyes were clearly on Nina. They didn't speak, but Nina could sense their rejection, their doubt, and their concern about the changes she represented. Each word from Mrs. Patricia felt like a knife cutting into Nina's heart. She felt that she wasn't just being opposed by one person, but by an entire community. The disdainful looks from Mrs. Patricia and her supporters made Nina feel surrounded. But in that moment, a thought flashed in her mind. If I don't fight, can I change anything? That was the question she asked herself, a question she knew would linger with her for the rest of her life. As the meeting continued, the opinions grew more divided. Some people supported Mrs. Patricia's views, saying there was no need for any change in the neighborhood. They argued that change would only make things chaotic and black people should live in other areas where they belong. These words seemed to not only show racial discrimination, but also a clear social divide. Meanwhile, Nina felt more and more excluded from that social circle. The people who didn't understand her, didn't understand the work she was doing, didn't understand that she was only trying to find a fair community, were the ones standing in the shadow of power and conservatism. Finally, as the meeting was nearing its end, Nina felt like a silent shadow stepping out of the room. No matter how hard she tried, she could not change the way people in Oakwood Estates viewed her. This left her with an indescribable pain. She realized that, in the eyes of these people, she was nothing but an outsider, someone who didn't belong here despite all her efforts to integrate. Nina's feelings at that moment were a loneliness like no other, the loneliness of someone living in a community but never being truly accepted. What she witnessed today was a reflection of a society she had to face every day, a society of discrimination and conservatism, where people like her always had to fight to be accepted. The question still echoed in her mind. Can I change Oakwood Estates? Or will Oakwood Estates change me? Nina knew there was still a long road ahead, a fight not just with the people here, but also with herself. Nina stood right outside the neighborhood. The coldness from the unfriendly stares seemed to envelop her entire body. The Oakwood Estates neighborhood still looked the same, but now it felt like a stage where she was the only actor playing a script she didn't know. She knew that all the silence and lack of acceptance in this community were directly pressuring her. With each passing day, Nina felt more like a rock in the middle of a rushing river, trying to hold her ground even though she knew she was slowly being swept away. She had to do something to make a change, but today, she felt like everything was beyond her control. That day, Nina was patrolling the neighborhood as usual, monitoring the less traveled areas where crimes could easily creep in. She was walking and thinking about the meeting from the day before. Mrs. Patricia's words still echoed in her mind, not because they hurt her, but because they seemed like the final blow to any hope of integrating into this place. Each of Nina's steps became heavier, as if the ground beneath her feet was slowly turning into quicksand, pulling her into self-doubt. From a distance, Nina saw Samuel Williams, the Black Street vendor she had met the day before, standing at the street corner selling goods. Today he was there with baskets of fresh fruit and a few household items. The scene appeared normal, but the signs of tension had started to become clear. A group of residents, including those Nina had seen at the meeting, were standing around Samuel. Their eyes were filled with anger, and the whispers grew louder. No one in the group dared to approach Samuel, but they stood there, surrounding him like wolves preparing to tear apart their prey. Nina couldn't watch any longer. She quickly walked over, noticing the disturbance. One of the men in the group saw her and immediately pointed at Samuel, as if he were a criminal. "The police are here now. You better get on with your business. Don't let him cause trouble," the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. Nina stood between these people who had no respect for each other. She looked at Samuel, his eyes clearly showing confusion and fear. She glanced back at the group, their cold stares making her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. A fierce storm unpredictable and terrifying, was looming, and Nina couldn't let Samuel fall into the hands of these people, who did not see him as a human. "He hasn't done anything wrong," Nina said, her voice calm but heavy with authority. "I will assess the situation, and all of you must cooperate." However, just as Nina began speaking to Samuel, Mrs. Patricia appeared from behind, as if she had been silently watching the entire time. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice filled with mockery. "A police officer is protecting this invader. Don't you see? A person like him doesn't belong here. Do your job. Don't act like you're helping a criminal." Nina looked at Mrs. Patricia, unable to hide her disappointment. "You don't understand," she replied, but didn't want to argue. She turned to Samuel and asked him to follow her out of this dangerous area. But before anything could happen, a phone rang, interrupting everything. One of the residents in the group had called the police. "Police, we have a street vendor causing trouble. He's bothering all of us. You need to come immediately," the man said, pointing at Samuel, his voice filled with urgency. Mrs. Patricia, hearing this, immediately added, "She's a police officer, and she's protecting an invader. I demand that she act immediately. Don't let this continue." Nina froze. She could hear the thudding of her heart, almost as if it was going to burst. Mrs. Patricia had pushed things too far. With one phone call, she had stirred up a mob full of rage and falsely alerted the authorities about Samuel. Nina was a police officer, but now she was caught in a situation she couldn't escape from. If Nina didn't act quickly, things could get much worse. However, everything seemed to be following an irreversible path. A series of police cars began arriving, their flashing lights cutting through the night. Other officers got out of the cars, each of them unable to hide the suspicion in their eyes as they looked at Nina. The other officers, who were unaware of the situation, only saw Samuel, a black man in a neighborhood of white people, and immediately they were ready to confront a tense situation. Nina tried to intervene, asking everyone to calm down, but her words seemed to fall into an endless void. The other officers didn't listen to her. Samuel was being led away, and Nina felt torn between her responsibilities as a police officer and the harsh reality of the racism she couldn't avoid. She felt that it wasn't just Mrs. Patricia, but the entire police force was turning against her. They didn't understand, they didn't see what she had gone through, and they didn't want to see. As Samuel was being taken away, his gaze toward Nina was filled with despair. She couldn't do anything. The people around them turned their backs and walked away, the light from the police cars dimming in the darkness, leaving only an indescribable feeling of emptiness. When everything finally quieted down, Nina stood alone in the quiet darkness of the neighborhood. She felt like she was surrounded by injustice and ignorance. She realized that she hadn't changed anything. She felt hopeless, as though all her efforts to build an inclusive community had been shattered in an instant. And at that moment, she asked herself, could she have done more? Or was everything just a meaningless struggle? When the last patrol car left, Nina stood alone on the sidewalk, her eyes following the silhouette of Samuel being led away. He didn't look back, his shoulders hunched like a shadow, as if he had accepted the cruelty of the world around him. Samuel's every step rang out clearly, but to Nina, those sounds were the echoes of failure, the undeniable helplessness. Despite being a police officer, someone tasked with protecting and serving, today she couldn't save an innocent man from a system that she herself couldn't change. The streetlights cast faint light, and the surrounding space grew eerily quiet. The tension within Nina felt like a rising tide, pushing her into her own dark corner. She stood there, questioning if she had made a mistake in choosing to be a police officer, or if there was something else she could do to change this system. Her conflicting thoughts gnawed at her mind, unrelenting. A car's horn broke Nina's train of thought. She turned around to see Mrs. Patricia from a distance, walking briskly with the remaining group of residents. She looked back at Nina, her gaze cold, offering no sympathy. Mrs. Patricia wasn't someone whose views could easily be swayed. Nina had known this for a long time. Mrs. Patricia always stood firm in what she called traditional values, never opening herself to anything that might disrupt the order of the neighborhood. "We don't need outsiders like him," Mrs. Patricia's voice echoed as she neared Nina. "This is our neighborhood, and we won't accept any disruption from people like him. Remember that." She turned away and addressed the group, not sparing Nina another glance. Her words were a firm assertion of her power within this neighborhood. Nina felt like a stranger, standing in the middle of a community that would never accept her. The tension didn't just come from the confrontation with Mrs. Patricia, but from the betrayal by her fellow officers. They didn't understand, didn't see the struggles Nina faced. The calls from Mrs. Patricia and the criticism from the residents only deepened the feeling of being pushed out. The police force wasn't just standing by in this struggle. They were helping maintain the injustice Nina was trying to fight. As the police cars drove away, Nina faced herself. On one hand, she was a law enforcer, but on the other hand, she felt trapped in a system where justice couldn't be served. Everything seemed to be pulling her into an inescapable loop that she couldn't break free from. The contradiction in Nina's heart grew clearer. How could she protect a community that didn't accept her efforts? How could she enforce justice when even those she trusted had turned against her? As Nina stood there, the residents continued to walk by, no one stopping to help, no one speaking up. She was part of this system, but she wasn't welcomed by it. The feeling of isolation swelled within Nina. She stood there, struggling to contain the frustration rising within her. She didn't know what more she could do other than continue doing her job as a police officer, a protector of the law, while the division and discrimination in the community grew deeper. That evening, Nina sat alone in her small apartment. She pulled out all the documents about the cases of racial discrimination in the neighborhood, but her mind couldn't focus. Every word seemed like an invisible wall blocking her vision. The reports, the stories about discrimination, about people like Samuel, about herself, felt like a vicious cycle she couldn't escape. She was carrying the responsibility, but that responsibility wasn't being fulfilled in a system she couldn't even change. Nina stood up from her desk, walked to the window, and looked outside. The entire neighborhood was still, but inside her was a storm that couldn't be extinguished. She looked into the darkness outside, wondering if anything could change. The answer was unclear. She couldn't find a way out, couldn't determine the boundary between justice and discrimination, between right and wrong in a society filled with contradictions. The weeks passed in silence, but the tension within Nina only grew. Every time she received a call from the neighborhood, every time she faced criticism from her colleagues, she felt herself being pushed further from her original goal. She couldn't continue being a police officer in a community like this. But if she gave up, could anything change? Finally, an unexpected event occurred. One morning, while patrolling the neighborhood, Nina noticed a group of people gathered around a car parked at the curb. She approached and discovered it was an accident, with a black man lying on the road. The man might have been a street vendor or a resident, but at that moment, Nina couldn't tell. The only thing she saw was a person in need of help. But as she got closer, a group of residents blocked her way, saying the man didn't deserve the police's help. "He's an outsider, not one of us," one of them said. "Don't you see? We can't help him." A wave of exhaustion rose within Nina. She stood there, trying to stay calm, but the truth was painfully clear. She couldn't do anything, couldn't change anything if even the people she was supposed to protect didn't want change. And in that moment, Nina realized something painful. She wasn't just trapped in her job, but in this very community. The rain from the previous night was like a test of Nina's patience. The next morning, as weak sunlight filtered through the wet leaves, Oakwood Estates looked unchanged. The streets were still quiet. The mansions still exuded their grandeur, and life continued to the rhythm of people who never had to worry about their existence. But Nina could no longer live as an outsider in this world. The ongoing events had torn apart the silence and helplessness she had been concealing within herself. The tension inside her became unbearable, as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, with every gust of wind pushing her further back. She couldn't simply turn her back on Oakwood Estates, but neither could she continue living in a community where no one understood her. Over the past months, Nina had tried, step by step, to find her way. But the more she tried, the more she realized that change wouldn't come easily, not through soft dialogues, not through acts of charity. If change was to come, it would have to come from a profound awakening, from recognizing the mistakes, the dark corners that everyone had long ignored. On a weekend afternoon, Nina met Samuel again. He was standing near the market, gazing into the distance as if searching for an escape, as though he had grown tired of the disdainful looks from those around him. But this encounter was different from the previous ones. Nina didn't know why, but she felt a strange strength rising within her, as if, at last, she was ready to face everything she had ignored. "Samuel, I need to talk to you," Nina spoke up. For the first time, her voice was no longer weak, no longer suppressed by doubts and worries. She spoke as if she understood everything he had been through, and as if she knew exactly what needed to be done to bring about change. Samuel turned around, his gaze filled with surprise, but then, gradually, a tired smile appeared on his face. "What else do you want to help with?" he asked, his voice full of disappointment, yet tinged with a bit of hope. This question wasn't a refusal, but a cry for help, as if he had been waiting for someone to lift the dark veil over his life. "You're not alone," Nina said. She took a step closer, looking into Samuel's eyes, and suddenly she realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for all along. "I know I can change this. We can change this if you believe." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, his eyes searching for the truth in Nina's gaze. It seemed that over the past months, he had become so accustomed to the idea that nothing could change that he had lost hope in anyone. But this time, something in Nina's eyes made him reconsider. "All right," Samuel said after a long silence. "I will trust you." Nina felt a new breath of air fill her soul. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed Samuel's help, and more importantly, she needed to change herself. She couldn't just stand there waiting for things to change without taking action. And right then, she knew she had to act, immediately. As soon as they decided to meet, Nina found a way to contact people in the community, but instead of trying to win their approval, she chose to organize a public event where people could discuss racial discrimination and justice. She didn't just want to speak out, she wanted people to listen. And she knew that, to make them hear her voice, she had to make them see the truth right before their eyes. A week later, Nina organized a public meeting at the community center. Everyone in the neighborhood was invited, from the residents to the local leaders. The meeting took place in an unfamiliar atmosphere, where strangers began exchanging views on issues no one wanted to bring up. Nina stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw those sitting in the front row, those who had always held power in the neighborhood. And she knew, if she couldn't convince them, she wouldn't be able to change anything. Once everyone was settled, Nina stood up and began sharing her story. She didn't just talk about her own disappointment, but also the pain she had witnessed over time. She talked about her encounter with Samuel, about the things she had seen in the neighborhood, about the racial discrimination no one dared acknowledge. She didn't just stand there speaking. She invited Samuel to come up and share his story. When Samuel stood up, he was no longer the man of despair. He stood tall, his eyes facing the crowd. "I'm a part of this neighborhood," he said, his voice ringing strong, no longer a plea but a declaration. "I deserve to be treated like anyone else. And I don't want this anymore. I don't want to live in silence. I don't want to live in contempt. I want you all to know that we can live together, and none of us deserve to be treated like this." The eyes of the people in the room changed. Their looks were no longer full of contempt, but of contemplation. Some of them, those who had always sided with Mrs. Patricia, began to reconsider their actions. Some lowered their heads. Others closed their eyes as if thinking about their own mistakes. A small change, but the first step toward changing the entire neighborhood. And that was the breakthrough. Not because of a great speech or action, but because the truth had been revealed and everyone could no longer turn a blind eye. Change had begun, and it came from the smallest steps Nina and Samuel had taken together. From then on, not only Nina, but the whole neighborhood began to realize that all discrimination could change if people were willing to face it. And Nina, who had once felt trapped, finally found a way out, not just for herself, but for the community she was trying to protect. Spring had passed, giving way to the scorching summer days, but the heat did nothing to lessen the tension in Oakwood Estates. Everything seemed to be waiting for an event that would change everything, and the public dialogue Nina had planned was the pivotal moment. She could no longer stay silent. The months spent facing racial discrimination with an unyielding conservatism that was impossible to accept now forced her to act. It was time for everyone in this neighborhood, no matter how difficult it may be, to confront the issues they had been trying to ignore for years. That morning, the atmosphere in Oakwood Estates felt different. The streets, the luxurious mansions, all seemed to be waiting for a big change. The residents, perhaps due to the event that day, had dressed more formally than usual, gathering at the community center where the dialogue would take place. Nina could sense the nervous anticipation in the air. Each person seemed to have a different mindset. The conservatives were worried, afraid of the change, while those who sought change were full of hope, hoping that today would be the day their struggles would finally be acknowledged. Nina walked into the room, looked around, and felt the tension in the eyes of everyone present. From afar, she could see Mrs. Patricia sitting in the front row, her gaze no longer as sharp as before, but still full of resolve. The other community members were waiting, but one thing was clear: none of them truly wanted change, at least not easily accepting this change. She said nothing, just quietly walked up to the podium. Nina's steps, though ordinary, held a strength as if she was entering a battle she could not turn away from. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, from the residents standing next to Mrs. Patricia to the others in the community. The silence was so profound that you could hear your own heartbeat. The words Nina would speak today weren't just about racial discrimination, but about fairness, about ending the old-fashioned thoughts and selfish lifestyles that had deeply embedded themselves in the minds of generations. "Thank you all for being here today," Nina began, her voice deep and firm. "I know today might be a challenge for many of you, but I believe that only by confronting the truth can we change, not only change this neighborhood, but change ourselves." She paused for a moment, gazing directly at the crowd. There was a silence so intense that you could feel the thoughts of each person wondering about her, about what she would say next. She saw the hesitation and anxiety in Mrs. Patricia's eyes, but she also saw eyes filled with hope. But most importantly, Nina had made them all listen. "You've all witnessed what's happened in this neighborhood, especially with Samuel," Nina continued, her gaze locking with Mrs. Patricia's. You can't deny that racism is not only here, but also in our daily actions. We can't just look at what we see and ignore the truth that exists right before our eyes. There were murmurs in the room, but Nina didn't stop. She went on, I understand that change always brings fear, but I also understand that this fear only exists when we are unwilling to face it. You may see Samuel as an intruder, but I see a person who lives in contempt, in unjust treatment, just because of the color of his skin. And I cannot remain silent about this any longer. Her voice no longer trembled, now filled with conviction, as if she had cast aside all doubt in her heart. The people in the room began to feel the strength in Nina's words. Mrs. Patricia looked at her, her face unchanged, but something in her eyes began to waver. Perhaps she still disagreed, but she couldn't deny the truth Nina was speaking. At that moment, Nina invited Samuel up. He walked to the podium, looking down, but not out of cowardice, rather with determination. He stood next to Nina, and in that moment, all eyes in the room were on them. You've heard me talk about Samuel, Nina continued. Now, let's hear Samuel share his story. She looked at Samuel and gave a small nod. Samuel didn't speak immediately. He stood there for a moment, as if searching for the right words. But when he spoke, it wasn't a plea, but a declaration. I've lived here all my life, but I've never truly felt accepted, Samuel began, his voice slow but filled with emotion. Every day I go out his cell. Every day I face the looks, the words, the rejections just because I don't look like them. I've never asked for pity, but I don't deserve to live in this contempt and discrimination. Some people in the crowd began to lower their heads, seemingly unable to maintain their indifference any longer. Samuel's words struck at their hearts, and what they had overlooked for so long was now clear before them. Samuel continued, I just want to live like anyone else, to be treated fairly. We're human too. We have a right to dream and live like anyone else. But why do we have to endure this contempt every day? If I don't speak up today, I'll never have the chance to live as a real human being again. Every word Samuel spoke flowed like a powerful stream, breaking down the icy walls in the hearts of everyone present. The people sitting there could no longer stay still. Some lowered their heads, others exchanged looks, but these looks no longer held hesitation, but understanding. It seemed as though a door had opened, and they could not help but walk through it. When Samuel finished, the room fell silent. Everyone seemed to be reflecting. This was a moment Nina knew that change had begun. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew that when people are faced with the truth, no matter how difficult it may be, they will have to change. Mrs. Patricia still sat there, saying nothing, but Nina could clearly see in her eyes that something had shifted. Not immediately, but she had to confront what she had been avoiding, what she had been trying not to see. When the dialogue ended, the atmosphere in the room was no longer tense like at the beginning. The people who attended the meeting stood up, no longer divided or separated, but with a shared understanding. That was the first step toward change. After the public dialogue, the atmosphere in Oakwood Estates changed noticeably. While it couldn't be denied that many barriers and divisions still existed within the community, one thing was clear. No one could continue to live in silence, avoiding the issue any longer. The looks, the words that were once invisible like invisible walls, had now turned into questions, answers that had yet to be found. Oakwood Estates was no longer the quiet place it used to be. It was slowly waking up, as if a wave had begun to stir in a silent neighborhood. The next day, as Nina stepped out of her house to begin a new work day, she felt something different in the air. It wasn't a complete change, but there was a fleeting shift in the way people looked at her. The looks were no longer filled with contempt, no longer dismissive as before, but neither was there clear empathy. It was simply a small change in attitude in the way the residents of Oakwood Estates approached one another. Mornings like this, where the heavy silence had once been part of life, now carried a bit of hope. Nina's work continued as usual. She kept patrolling, attending community meetings, but this time she didn't feel like an outsider anymore. Everything seemed more achievable, although there were still many conservatives, those who didn't accept change. She could sense a shift in the community she was living in. A few days later, another community meeting was held. This time, Mrs. Patricia was no longer the only one voicing her opinions. The community had begun to change, and people like Nina, those who had raised their voices, now had the power to propose other initiatives. The meeting started with calls for change, with the participation of many who had previously remained on the sidelines. Initiatives for inclusion and fairness began to appear in the discussions. A new scholarship fund was created, not only for the children in the neighborhood, but also extended to families in need, families from diverse ethnic communities. Of course, opposition still existed, but it was no longer as strong as before. Mrs. Patricia, although not easily swayed, had now become part of the discussion. After many tense debates, she finally agreed to participate in a diversity and inclusion training program. This was a significant step. Though small, it was enough for Nina to feel that things weren't hopeless. Mrs. Patricia, who had once been a symbol of conservatism, now began to realize that change was inevitable. And although she still defended her traditional values, her willingness to listen and learn was an important step forward. One of the most important initiatives Nina found herself involved in was organizing classes about racism and fairness in the neighborhood. These classes weren't just for children, but also extended to adults to help them understand the issues that people of color face. Why are they discriminated against? Why are they not treated fairly? These classes provided an opportunity for the community to reassess their own biases and behaviors, to understand that change must start from within each individual's heart. Although it was just the beginning, Nina felt that Oakwood Estates was moving closer to something greater. It wasn't just a change in the mindset of a few people, but a change in the entire community. The people involved in these initiatives were no longer alone. They no longer had to endure silence or criticism. Each person, even if only a little, had opened up, and that was the most important change. Especially when Samuel, who had once always felt ostracized, now began to take on an important role in the community. He no longer just sold goods, but had opened a small shop selling products he made himself. People started coming to buy from him, not out of pity, but out of respect. They realized that not everyone deserves to be judged by their skin color or prejudices. Samuel was now an essential part of Oakwood Estates. Of course, there were still those who didn't want change, still those who tried to stir up conflicts. But this time, Nina no longer felt isolated. She knew that she couldn't change everything overnight, but she also realized that what she had done had made a noticeable impact. She began to receive support from colleagues in the police force, those who had previously not understood the pain she had endured. Conversations with her colleagues became easier. She no longer had to prove she was right, but simply needed to show them the truth they had been unwilling to see. The Oakwood Estates community began to organize events to foster unity, parties, sports activities, where people from all walks of life, all ethnicities, could gather and share with one another. These events not only helped connect people, but also helped them reconsider the value of unity, of mutual respect, regardless of background or skin color. With each step, Nina felt change coming. Although many challenges still lay ahead, she no longer felt like she was walking alone. The community had changed, and Nina herself had changed. She was no longer the outsider, the one isolated, but an integral part of the process of making Oakwood Estates a truly inclusive place. The change, though small, though slow, had definitely begun, and Nina knew that this was only the beginning. Every day, she continued walking, not to seek recognition, but to help this community see that change, no matter how difficult, is always possible. As long as they are willing to recognize and confront the issues they have been trying to avoid, Oakwood Estates would never go back to the way it was. And Nina, who had found strength in the smallest things, would never stop in this journey. Oakwood Estates had changed, no longer a divided community, but a neighborhood that was gradually rediscovering unity and justice. The summer heat didn't make the air as stifling as it had in previous years, but instead, it seemed that the sunlight was driving away the darkness of racism and ignorance that had deeply rooted in the neighborhood. Nina's relentless efforts, along with Samuel's support and the changing awareness of the residents, had created a pivotal moment in the history of Oakwood Estates. That weekend, a celebration was held at the central park of the neighborhood, where gatherings had once been quiet, linked to division and prejudice. Today, the atmosphere was somewhat different, as if a new openness, a new hope had emerged. This celebration was not just to celebrate the changes, but also to acknowledge the efforts of each individual in the community, those who had stood up together and broken down the invisible walls that everyone once thought could never be erased. Nina wasn't the only one to feel this change. Mrs. Patricia, who had once been a symbol of conservatism, who had stood for old values and discrimination, was now standing among those pushing for change. Standing next to her was Samuel, who once again had the opportunity to see himself not as an outsider, but as an integral part of this community. The two stood side by side, no longer with doubt or judgment, but with respect built over time. The celebration began with speeches from community leaders. But today, no one stood up to assert power or defend old values. Instead, everyone spoke about change, about inclusion, about building a community without discrimination. Stories were shared about the times they had faced difficulties, about the times they had been wrong, and learned from those mistakes. Nina looked around, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone anymore. She saw the change in the eyes of those around her, those who had once kept their distance, those who had never thought Oakwood Estates could become a truly inclusive place. As the event moved into the social hour, Nina and Samuel stood together in the crowd, no longer facing looks of prejudice or threats. The residents came up to them, not to judge, but to talk, to ask about the changes they could help bring about. They began discussing future projects, continuing classes on racism and inclusion, and working with outside organizations to sustain this change. These were no small steps, but it seemed that each one carried deep meaning, a desire for change not only from the outside, but from within each person. Samuel had reopened his shop after facing challenges, no longer a small street vendor, but now a small business owner in the community, contributing significantly to the change in Oakwood Estates. His customers came to his shop, not out of pity, but out of respect. They realized that not everyone deserved to be judged by their skin color or prejudices. Samuel was now an indispensable part of life in Oakwood Estates. And Nina, who had once felt like she couldn't change anything, now clearly felt the change, not only in how people treated her, but in how they viewed the issue of racism. She was no longer a solitary police officer in a closed-off community, but a part of a small but meaningful revolution. She realized that she hadn't stood alone in this fight, but was part of a larger wave of change, even if it started with small steps. And those steps wouldn't stop. As the event concluded, Nina stood outside, looking in the neighborhood. The residents were gathering, talking, laughing together. Although not everything was perfect, Nina knew that through these dialogues and the changes happening day by day, this community was heading in the right direction. Oakwood Estates was no longer just a place for people who were alike, but a community that embraced everyone, where all people, regardless of skin color or background, could find their place, a place where they could live authentically. With each laugh, each handshake, Nina felt a part of the strength she and the community had created. It wasn't a top-down change, but a bottom-up change from within the hearts of each person. Although she knew there would be many challenges ahead, Nina no longer felt afraid. She had seen the light at the end of the road, and it was a light that no one could extinguish. Change was not just a moment, it was an ongoing process. And Nina knew she would continue walking with this community on that path. A path not only toward inclusion, but toward respect, fairness, and the love each person deserves. The story of Nina and the Oakwood Estates community is not only a personal struggle, but also a grand journey of change within society as a whole. It is a journey that moves from silence and fear to facing and confronting deep-rooted issues that a community may choose to ignore. The story is not just timely, but also reflects problems that modern society still faces. Racism, conservatism, the silence when faced with injustice, and a necessary change to build a more just and inclusive society. Nina, as a young black police officer in a predominantly white community, had to endure and face prejudices that not everyone can understand. From the moment she set foot in Oakwood Estates, she felt a subtle discrimination, not just from the residents, but also from those she thought would stand by her in her work, her fellow police officers. This is an inseparable part of this story, as the discrimination within those responsible for upholding justice became the starting point for all the problems. Nina was not only a police officer, but also a black woman, someone who had no choice but to confront difficult questions, challenging situations. However, instead of choosing to deal with it passively or retreat, Nina decided to stand up. She realized that only by confronting and fighting these issues could she create change, not only for herself, but for the whole community. In the process, she also realized that every individual could be a catalyst for change, not by changing the world immediately, but by taking small but resolute actions. The story also clearly shows the power of listening and learning. Intense dialogues. When Nina shared her story, she didn't just want to convince people to reconsider how they treat others, but also to make them see that change is not something too distant. We don't have to wait for a monumental change from someone else. We ourselves can be the ones to start the change. Nina's words were not commands, but heartfelt shares from painful experiences she had endured. The public dialogue Nina organized was a significant turning point in this story. Not because it solved all the problems immediately, but because it was an opportunity for people to face the truth, to reconsider the prejudices that had been deeply rooted for so long. It was a reminder that discrimination doesn't only exist in grand actions, but also in words, in looks, in the silence we allow ourselves to continue enduring. This story shows that sometimes change starts from small actions, simple conversations, from someone daring to stand up and say, "We need to change." The lesson the story offers is one of patience and perseverance. Nina didn't stop when faced with hardship, when she wasn't recognized, when she was criticized and judged for things beyond her control. She learned that one of the strongest ways to confront discrimination is not to give up, but to keep acting, even if it takes a long time for people around her to recognize the need for the changes she was advocating. Her steps, though small, but full of strength, have created lasting change. The story also emphasizes that change cannot come from one individual alone. It is a process that requires the community's participation. Samuel, who was once a street vendor looked down upon by society, is now part of the change process, not just through his own story, but through the concrete actions he took. Each of Samuel's steps, from reopening his shop to becoming an important part of the community, is proof of the power of not giving up, of reclaiming one's rights, and of creating change through small actions. Moreover, the story reflects an undeniable truth in modern society. Change must start from each individual. Each of us has a responsibility to create a better world. If we want a society free of racism and discrimination, we must work tirelessly to change ourselves, to overcome prejudices, and to become pioneers in building an inclusive community. Change is not easy, and it requires time, patience, and sometimes sacrifice. The story of Nina and Samuel is a clear example of how one person can change an entire community simply by confronting injustice and fighting relentlessly. The message is a reminder that change, though difficult and challenging, can always happen if we dare to stand up, face the truth, and act to build a fairer world. Finally, this story reminds us of the power of courage. Courage is not only about confronting the difficulties ahead, but also about overcoming oneself, transcending the limits that society has imposed on us, and daring to do what others will not. Nina's courage was not just about overcoming external enemies, but also overcoming the fears and doubts she had faced all along. The greatest lesson this story offers is, if each of us is determined and dares to confront ourselves and society, then change, no matter how difficult, is achievable. The small steps of Nina, Samuel, and each individual in Oakwood Estates have created a more united, inclusive, and fair community. And that is the message this story wants to convey to all of us. Change is not something far away, but an action that can start from each individual.